Please be seated. Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. The great Southern Catholic writer Flannery O'Connor once wrote to a friend that this prayer, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, is, quote, the most natural and most human and most agonizing prayer in the Gospels. It is, O'Connor believed, the foundation prayer of faith. Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Now, I agree that it is the most human and most natural and foundational. I don't think it's the most agonizing. I think there's another that is much harder to pray truthfully. But Lord, I believe, help my unbelief is the place most of us start. And it's the place that we often return to over and over and over again. The context for this prayer, if you remember, is the Gospel of Mark. And it occurs around the same time that this tete-a-tete between Peter and Jesus have in our Matthew reading today. So remember the context, everything that's been happening. Jesus and the disciples have been traveling around and teaching and healing. The disciples have been part of feeding 5,000 people in the wilderness with just a couple of loaves of bread and a few fish. They've seen Jesus calm a storm. They've seen him walk on water. Peter has even just proclaimed him to be the Son of God. And then everything starts to change. Jesus starts talking about being taken to Jerusalem and undergoing great suffering. And he takes a few of them up a mountain and is transfigured before them. And on their way back down, they see a crowd around the disciples. And there's a lot of shouting and yelling because a man has brought his son who has a spirit that convulses him, makes him foam at the mouth and unable to speak. And the disciples can't do a thing about it. So the Father appeals to Jesus saying, if you are able, have pity on us and help us. And Jesus replies, all things can be done for the one who believes. To which the Father replies with this most natural, human, and foundational prayer, Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Yes, I believe, but maybe not enough. Maybe not in the right way. Maybe there's something missing. Or maybe there's something that gets in the way. The power of prayer and the power of belief are often bound up together. All things can be done for the one who believes. If you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you believe, it will be done for you. Power of prayer and the power of belief, they are wrapped up together, like a bush that burns but is not consumed. And because they exist together, it can be a trap for us. Because what happens if I pray for something, but it doesn't happen? Did God do something wrong? Didn't hear me? Ignored me? Or did I do something wrong? Didn't say the right words? Didn't perform the right rituals? Didn't have enough faith, enough belief? Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Prayer and belief are tied together, but we have to remember that prayer is not about trying to change God's mind. And it may not even be about effecting change in the world always. Prayer is simply being in communion with God. It is entering into a union and being one with God, in the same way that Jesus is one with God. Jesus does all of these things because he and the Creator are one. We are also one with the Creator and one with Jesus, but there's always something that gets in the way, something that makes our unbelief seem more real to us than our faith. Our unbelief, says one scholar, is the despair we feel when we feel that nothing can really change. So what's the point? Or on the other hand, when we feel that nothing should ever change. Don't go. What so often gets between us and God is our well-worn, time-tested, absolute conviction that we know how the world works, that a bush on fire will always be burned up, that 5 loaves and 2 fish will never feed that many people, that the Messiah, the chosen one, God's own Son, will never be handed over to suffer and die. We live in this world, so we know how it works. Or we certainly have opinions about how we think the world should work. And very often we also think that we therefore know how God works. Or we think we know how God should work, especially if it's always to our benefit. If prayer and belief are bound together, then on the other side of that coin is our disbelief, bound up in our need to have our own way. Our disbelief bound up with our own will. Which is why I think the most agonizing prayer is not always help my unbelief, but not my will, but yours be done. That's harder to pray. That can be agonizing to pray and really believe it, because it means not only setting aside our disbelief, but it means surrendering our stake in the outcome. Not my will, but yours be done is agonizing to pray. For example, when a friend is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, or when a relative is sinking deeper into dementia, or when a loved one is taken to the hospital, when your kids are facing choices that you never had to face and are making decisions that you never had to make. It is even agonizing to pray this when a colleague tells you that they are on the short list and may potentially be called as priest in charge at another parish. In those moments, it's very easy and natural and human to sound like Peter today. God forbid! That must never happen to you. Which, if we're honest, is really another way of saying, please don't let that happen to me. It is in those moments when we are confronted, I think, with just how much religion costs. To quote Flannery O'Connor again, what people don't realize is how much religion costs. They think faith is a big electric blanket, when of course it is the cross. Or, as Jesus points out, it is setting our minds on human things rather than divine things. focusing our will on what we want to happen for us and not what God needs to happen for the sake of the world. And so in this and in every time of transformation, friends, let us strive to pray for God's will to be done, always and in all things. And if that's too much, if that's too difficult or too agonizing, and often it is, remember Jesus only prays that in the Garden of Gethsemane. If that's too agonizing, then return to that foundational prayer. Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Help me in my despair, in my confusion, in my lostness. And then just wait. Just wait for God's will to become clear and for God's will to be done. Amen.